Today we'll hear ghostly apparitions during Halloween. When the most terrifying night of the year arrives, sometimes the supernatural makes its presence known, leaving more than one person frozen with fear.
The final warning.
We never should have accepted the dare to enter the cemetery that night, especially after we saw the old woman staring at us from the darkness. It was Halloween, and as usual, Tony and I thought we were brave. There was no way we were going to refuse the challenge from the group. Enter the old cemetery in our town at midnight. They said it had been abandoned for years, and no one dared to enter because of the legends about an old woman who guarded it. We crossed the rusty gate and went in. The place was darker than we expected, with gravestones covered in moss and weeds growing everywhere. Every step we took made dry branches crack under our feet. We walked between the tombstones, laughing at the old names and trying to make the experience lighter. But after a few minutes, the air changed. The wind stopped, and an even colder chill took over the place. That's when we heard it for the first time. A soft but unmistakable murmur coming from somewhere nearby. We turned our heads, but there was no one there. "Did you hear that?" Tony whispered. I nodded, pointing towards a small hill in the distance where they said the old woman's grave was. We started to move closer, and the closer we got, the louder the murmurs became, until they turned into a raspy, faint voice, like someone speaking from underground. But the strangest thing was the feeling that someone was watching us. When we reached the top, we saw her, standing next to one of the oldest gravestones. An old woman, hunched over, wearing tattered clothes, completely gray. Her face was wrinkled and her eyes, empty, seemed to burn with an indescribable fury. We didn't move, frozen by fear. Then she spoke. "You shouldn't be here," she said in a low, trembling voice, but clear enough to chill us to the bone. Tony mumbled something, and the woman raised a skeletal hand, pointing at us. "Leave," she whispered. But it wasn't a human whisper. It was like the wind was speaking through her. I felt a pressure on my chest, an impossible weight to describe, as the figure of the old woman slowly moved toward us, her feet barely touching the ground. It was like she was floating over the earth. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Tony shook me hard, managing to get me to move. We started running down the hill, but no matter how fast we ran, I could feel her behind us, her cold breath like ice on the back of our necks. The branches around us creaked and snapped, as if something was moving through them, getting closer. It didn't matter how fast we ran, she was still there. Every time I glanced back, I saw her figure moving through the shadows, but she wasn't slow anymore. Now she advanced at an unnatural speed, and her face, once just wrinkled, was twisted into a look of pure rage. Her eyes white, and her mouth contorted in a hateful sneer. The air around us grew heavier, and the murmurs that were once whispers turned into bone-chilling screams. They seemed to come from everywhere, like the voices of hundreds of lost souls filling the cemetery. I couldn't take my eyes off her. She was closer now, her hand reaching out toward me, her long, bony fingers almost touching my back. The smell of damp earth and decay filled the air, and the sound of her labored, furious breathing made me feel like there was no escape. We reached the gate. Tony pushed it with all his strength, while I felt her right behind me. I turned my head one last time and saw her face inches from mine. Her mouth slowly opened, and from it came one word. "I'll be back." With a final effort, we crossed the gate and ran into the street. The air shifted again, and the unbearable cold that had surrounded us vanished in an instant. But the old woman hadn't disappeared. She stood there watching us from the other side, motionless, her eyes fixed on us. We ran without looking back, our legs trembling, and we didn't stop until we reached our neighborhood. We looked at each other, but said nothing. We never spoke about what happened or what we saw. But since that night, sometimes I still feel her furious gaze on me, as if she's waiting for the right moment to come for me and make sure I don't escape.
Trapped at home.
I thought the Halloween decorations on the door were the scariest thing that night, until he appeared, staring right at me. I had always liked Halloween, but this year was different. My parents went out to a party, leaving me alone at home. It was the first time I would spend Halloween night without them, but I thought it would be fun. I had candy, horror movies, and my phone. I didn't need anything else. Everything was fine until I heard the first knock on the door. I thought it was kids from the neighborhood, even though it was too late for trick-or-treating. I got up and opened the door, but there was no one. I looked both ways. The street was empty. No one was around. I quickly shut the door, feeling a little uneasy, and made sure it was locked tight. I went back to the couch and tried to focus on the movie I was watching, but something made me feel uncomfortable. Then, I heard the sound of footsteps upstairs. My room was on the second floor, and I knew no one else was in the house. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe it was the wind, but the footsteps were clear, too clear, and they seemed to be getting closer. I grabbed my phone and cautiously climbed the stairs, feeling cold sweat on my back. When I reached the hallway, everything was silent. The bedroom doors were closed, but something didn't feel right. I walked slowly toward my room, which was the last one at the end of the hall. The door was slightly open. I pushed the door open slowly, and everything seemed normal. But when I turned around, I saw him, a figure standing in the corner, hidden in the shadows. He was tall, thin, and wore some kind of old black suit. His eyes were sunken, almost empty, and he was staring directly at me. Fear paralyzed me. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. He didn't move either. He was just there, watching me. I closed my eyes, hoping that when I opened them, he would be gone. But when I did, he was closer. I could see his face more clearly. His skin was gray and cracked. I felt my legs give way. I tried to step back, but he extended a hand toward me. Even though he was still a few feet away, I felt pressure on my chest, like something invisible was pushing me. I ran out of the room, rushing down the stairs. My heart was pounding, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I tried to call my parents, but my phone screen only showed no signal. And then the sound came again. It was heavy breathing behind me. I turned slowly, and there he was. Halfway down the stairs, his head tilted to one side like he was studying me. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Only a low, guttural growl. I ran to the front door, desperate to open it, but the lock wouldn't budge, as if it were stuck. The air felt heavier, colder, and I knew he was getting closer. I couldn't see him, but I could feel him. I turned toward the hallway, and there he was again, this time closer. I could smell the rot in the air. His hand lifted and pointed at me. I knew he wasn't going to let me leave. With trembling hands, I ran to the kitchen. The back door was there, and I thought maybe I could escape that way. I heard his footsteps, slow and heavy, like he enjoyed getting closer. When I reached the door, it wouldn't open either. I didn't turn around, but I felt his cold breath behind me, and my whole body tensed, frozen. Suddenly, I heard my parents' car pulling into the driveway, and the sound of keys before the front door opened. That made the figure stop. I turned, and he looked at me one last time before vanishing into the air, as if he had never been there. I ran to the door and managed to open it. My parents were on the porch, about to come inside. I told them what had happened, but they said it was just my imagination, or maybe a nightmare. I tried to convince myself of that, but something inside me couldn't forget. I never stayed home alone on Halloween again. Even now, years later, I sometimes still feel his cold breath behind me, and I wonder if he's come back for me.
The Impostor.
I didn't realize the boy walking beside me wasn't my friend until he looked me in the eyes and smiled in a way I'll never forget. It was Halloween night, and like every year I went trick-or-treating with my best friend Charlie. We were 10 years old, and after finishing our route, we would always stroll around the neighborhood. This year, we didn't dress up. We just painted our faces like clowns. We decided to take a shortcut through the neighborhood park, a dark and almost deserted place that night. As we entered the park, the atmosphere changed. It felt heavy, and the streetlights that normally illuminated the park now emitted a dim light. Charlie and I were joking around, but there was something in the air that kept me from fully relaxing. The wind whispered through the branches, and every now and then I swore I heard footsteps beyond our own, but when I looked around, no one was there. At some point, Charlie ran ahead, crossing to the other side of the park, leaving me a few meters behind. As I walked, I saw a figure approaching from the darkness, its silhouette familiar. I thought it was Charlie, who had turned back, so I didn't give it much thought when he walked up beside me. We walked together in silence for a few minutes, but something didn't feel right. I tried to crack a joke, but he didn't respond. He just glanced at me and, after a moment, smiled again. Something about that smile made me step back. It was too inhuman, like someone who had never felt a real emotion was trying to mimic one. My heart began to race, and suddenly a terrifying thought crossed my mind. This wasn't Charlie. As I looked at him, his smile widened, revealing uneven teeth, and his eyes, though similar to my friend's, reflected no light. They were hollow, cold. In that moment, I knew. Whoever was walking beside me wasn't Charlie. I stepped back and called his name, but the figure didn't respond. It just started moving toward me slowly, as if studying me. My mind clouded with panic, and I began to run. The footsteps behind me grew heavier, faster. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, trying to escape whatever was using my friend's body. When I reached the park's entrance, I saw someone approaching from the opposite direction. It was Charlie, the real Charlie. His breathing was heavy, and his face showed confusion, which quickly turned to concern when he saw me. "What's wrong?" he asked, genuinely confused. I couldn't say anything. I just stared in horror toward the park entrance. The figure that had been chasing me had stopped a few meters away, watching us from the shadows. Although I couldn't make out its face clearly, I felt its gaze fixed on us, and that same twisted smile gleamed from the darkness. I slowly raised my arm and pointed toward where the impostor was, indicating to Charlie where to look. It was still there. We could see the figure of that boy smiling at us without breaking its gaze, as if waiting for something from us. I told Charlie to run, and without waiting for a response, we both sprinted toward the houses, not daring to look back. We could feel something else, something following us, a presence lurking just a few meters behind, even though we could no longer see it. We reached the main street and stopped, both of us exhausted and gasping for air, trying to calm the shaking in our legs. We looked at each other without saying a word. We knew what had happened made no sense. We knew something had followed us. We left without looking back. Even though we were surrounded by houses and kids trick-or-treating, that feeling of being watched never left. I could sense that if I turned around, that thing would still be there, waiting. Charlie and I never talked about what happened that night. I haven't walked through that park at night since. But sometimes, even during the day when I pass by, I can can still feel the presence of that boy. And when I close my eyes, I can see him again, watching me with that smile that still sends chills down my spine. Thank you for journeying with us through the dark passages of these stories. If you enjoyed them, give us a like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more tales of terror. Until next time, where fear will once again be your companion.